These are the current recommendations for athletes. I mean, they're being told to just shovel carbohydrates in order to augment their performance and their recovery. And this clearly isn't working for a lot of athletes. And so we're starting to see an alternative view by the way of low carb, high fat diets. And I'll just call out, Tim Noakes has really been, I think, a pioneer in calling out the limitations of high carb diets, of which he was a strong proponent for his entire career, until he really had no other choice but to try a low carb diet in order to manage his own diabetes. And that was a couple years ago, and he's done a complete U-turn now, and in an incredibly gracious manner actually apologized to all the readers of his books and articles, that admitting that he basically got it wrong. And there's many other examples now of books coming on the market that are really calling out the limitations of the high carb approach for athletes. In essence, though, we really have very little information. We're really in our infancy in understanding how ketogenic diets might augment performance, and we're really left with a lot of testimonials and anecdotes. And so I'm going to at least share some of those with you because they're pretty compelling. This is Tim Olson, who remarkable ultra-endurance runner, competing at the Western States Endurance Run here in 2011. And he's a well-described, documented low-carb athlete. And he not only finished this race, but won and set a course record. So tremendous feat of performance. This is just a grueling event, 100 miles through the Sierra Nevada mountains. I was at the finish line here. We were doing some field work and studying some of these low-carb athletes, and he looked pretty fresh finishing this race. Really remarkable. I don't know if you can see the time there. He ran this in 14 hours and 46 minutes. And it wasn't an anomaly. He came back the next year and won under, I think, harsher conditions, one of the hottest years here at the Western States, but won again pretty convincingly. And he's not the only one by any means. Zach Bitter, who I have the pleasure of knowing and actually have studied in the lab, is another remarkable low-carb ultra-endurance runner who holds the 100-mile track record, and set that about a year and a half ago, and then rebroke his record just the last couple weeks ago. So he is dialing in his low-carb diet, and seems to continuously be getting better and recovering faster. This is John Rutherford, who we've also studied in the lab. I think he's our highest fat burner ever recorded, but fascinating person. F-18 pilot, that's actually his jet here, Captain John Rutherford. Just a remarkable guy, and has performed extraordinarily on a low-carb, high-fat diet. Perhaps one of the greatest ultra runners of all time is Mike Morton, who in his 40s had a resurgence in his running, winning several 100-mile races, competing on back-to-back weekends in 100-mile races, and winning and setting a record in one of those, also holding the record for 24-hour distance. And so another example of what can be achieved in the keto-adapted state. And it's not just ultra-endurance athletes and individual athletes. There's many examples of teams sports now adopting some version of low-carb diets. The LA Lakers and several soccer team and rugby teams. The All Blacks is a champion rugby team in New Zealand. And I just found out maybe 9 months ago or so that the Columbus Crew, right next door to where I live, has adopted a low-carb diet for over a year now. And they did quite well if anybody follows professional soccer in the U.S. And so they are extremely interested in learning more about low-carb diets and taking it to the next level. There's many, many other examples of team sports really interested in this. I've had the wrestling team at OSU contact me incessantly to want to adopt a low-carb diet for their wrestlers, and they're not too shabby. They were national champions last year. Bodie Miller, Lindsey Vaughn are some of our top downhill skiers have commented on their positive response to a low-carb diet. And examples go on and on. There's many others, and probably people in the audience. I know Peter Defty's here, and he trains a lot of these guys and has a lot of wisdom in terms of the nuances of how to implement the diet. So why would a diet that's low in carb and high in fat be beneficial for athletes when we have been told for decades, and the textbooks all say we need carbs and ketones are toxic? So I just listed a few here, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on all of these, but one of the most obvious and straightforward reasons is we evolved to store energy much more in much greater quantities as fat than carbohydrates. So if we were meant to be burning a lot of carb, we would have thought from an evolutionary perspective we should be able to store a lot, but we can only jam about 500 grams of carbs into glycogen. So that's limiting. That's a couple hours of moderate intensity exercise for most individuals. So it's stored in greater quantities. It's also a more efficient nutrient, and you can operationally define efficiency in different ways, but the obvious way is it has over twice the calories per unit weight. It's stored in basically anhydrous fashion, so we don't store a lot of water and extra weight with it like we do glycogen. And it seems to also be more efficient in terms of its production of ATP. So we get more ATP per unit oxygen when it's oxidized in the mitochondria compared to other substrates. So there's several examples of greater efficiency with fat versus other substrates. And if you're burning fat at a higher rate during exercise, and you can get fat from your diet, but when you don't have exogenous fat coming in, you can access your own fat stores. So if you're a better fat burner, you have less need to fuel during exercise, and that is really a challenging issue for a lot of ultra endurance athletes that have to repetitively be taking in carbohydrates during exercise because they're not efficient fat burners. Ketones generate less ROS, and I think we've had some talks and we've heard a bit about that, but at least in some basic science studies, a lot of Veach's work suggesting that ketones are more efficient in terms of their oxidation and generate less exhaust or less reactive oxygen species or free radicals than other substrates. And that's, I think, of primary importance with endurance athletes because there's a tremendous amount of oxidative stress associated with the high energy expenditures, and the body has to absorb that. Just less reliance on limited fuel sources that we have in glycogen, less generation of lactic acid if we're not breaking down glycogen into glucose, so that makes for less acid-base stress. A lot of athletes, we have sort of these indirect benefits where a lot of athletes could benefit from losing a little bit of fat and being more efficient in terms of their power to weight ratios and so forth. So you don't have to be obese to benefit from this, but even 5-10 pounds of fat loss can enhance efficiency in running greatly without losing lean tissue. And we basically make athletes bonk-proof when they're keto adapted, and this tracks back to the classic function of ketones, which is to be an alternative fuel source for the brain. And so ironically, as the longer you exercise, the more ketones you have available to fuel the brain as opposed to less substrate when your brain's running on glucose. So that's a profound benefit for the ultra endurance athletes anyway. And then we have the signaling or epigenetic effects of ketones, where basically beta-hydroxybutyrate is acting like a hormone to signal less inflammation, less oxidative stress. And I think this really is an important feature in the enhanced recovery that so many athletes comment on when they're keto adapted, that they're able to recover much, much quicker than when they were on a high carb diet. And there's just this, we have a lot of cellular mechanisms identified as to how exercise benefits insulin sensitivity, mitochondrial biogenesis, et cetera, et cetera. That's why we promote exercise. But a lot of those benefits have been shown to be attenuated or completely ameliorated when you provide carbohydrates after exercise. So I really don't think slamming a lot of carbohydrates after exercise, which we're told to do to replenish glycogen, is good for overall health. And of course, we're seeing this play out as athletes get into middle age and they're obese and they're pre-diabetic. You really just can't outrun your insulin resistance, as many examples of that, including Tim Noakes. So given the lack of really any evidence out there in long-term keto adaptation, we were motivated to try to convince a group of low-carb, keto-adapted athletes to come to our lab at the time in Connecticut, the University of Connecticut. So we designed this study called the FASTER study, which was really pretty simple in nature. We wanted to basically peek under the hood of the keto-adapted athlete and see what makes them tick and what type of metabolic adaptations do they manifest, because that really had not been done before, at least long-term keto adaptation. So we did this about 2 years ago. I guess we started recruiting for this, and the first paper we published in Metabolism a couple months ago. So the basic design was to recruit 10 high-level ultra-endurance runners that were traditionally on the high-carb diet, and then 10 that were as low a carb as we could find. And as you can kind of tell by the table here, these are very well matched, and that's, I think, really important for interpretation and comparison, because these essentially were twins. We tried to find identical age, weight, training status, performance status, and then match them into the high-carb, low-carb groups. And it turns out they're very well matched, and even their engine is about the same here. They're very close VO2 max. So these guys are all similar in terms of their biology, in terms of even their genetic makeup. They probably have to be somewhat genetically homogeneous to self-select to be this high level of athletes. So these were all ultra endurance, so triathlon and beyond. Most of these guys were 50-mile, 100-mile primary events. And we had no problem finding these guys. They were really an amazing group of athletes that were so gracious and happy to come to the lab, and we did a lot of invasive procedures on these guys. The primary feature was a 3-hour run on a treadmill, and we had a lot of needles and protocols for collecting biological specimens built around that and into recovery, including muscle biopsies, fat biopsies, collecting their feces, saliva, cheek cells. We were infusing tracers into these guys, and honestly, these guys smiled the whole time and left thanking us. It was pretty incredible, because I thought we'd have to twist their arm and pay them a fortune to do this, and they didn't even want any money. So what did we find? First, to give you a little context, because this this parameter here is not something we necessarily see often, but when we ask the question, how much can fat burn? So what's the maximal rate of fat oxidation in humans? That question has been addressed in quite a few studies, and this is probably the largest, most comprehensive study to address that question. And you can see from this, there's quite a scatter here. This included over 300 individuals, including some high-level athletes in this cohort. And the highest individual here was about 1 gram per minute of fat oxidized. And that's not related to maximal oxygen consumption, as you can see. But of any individual, that's the highest rate I've ever seen reported in the literature. So that seems to kind of be a ceiling that exists where humans can't burn more fat than that. So we tested this in the FASTER cohort, and this is the peak fat oxidation in the high carb group. And I should note these are really extraordinarily high levels, because these are elite athletes. They're very good fat burners, and so that's pretty good. You have one guy approaching that 1 gram per minute. But this is the low carb athletes. So you can see twofold higher rates of peak fat oxidation. The highest fat burner in the high carb groups lower than the lowest fat burner in the low carb groups. So just extraordinary ability to burn fat. And this was done during a incremental exercise test on a treadmill. And then the following day, we did a 3-hour run on a treadmill. Well, I'm sorry, I'll come to that in a second. So this is data from the same incremental exercise test on the treadmill. And this is looking at fat oxidation as a function of exercise intensity. And these are sort of classic graphs, if you've read an exercise physiology textbook, where you typically see fat oxidation at low intensity exercise gradually increases during moderate intensity exercise. And then at around 50-60% it peaks, and then it drops sharply as you increase exercise intensity for many reasons, and people have tried to identify why. And this is the graph in the low carb athletes. So you see everything's pushed up markedly and to the right, such that peak fat oxidation occurs at, I think, around 70 some percent VO2 max, where it's closer to 55 or so in the low carb athletes. So they're able to push their fat oxidation up at higher exercise intensities. They still get that drop off though at close to max. So this is the 3-hour run on the treadmill. And we locked in the intensity here, so they're exercising at 64% of VO2 max, which is a pretty easy pace for these guys. So 3 hours was kind of a warm-up for many of them. And you can see on the left, the high carb guys, this is very typical, where they burn about a 50-50 mix of carbs and fat. Tends to drop off a bit in terms of fat as exercise progresses, as glycogen becomes depleted. But in the low carb athletes, they get almost 90% of their energy from fat, and that's pretty stable over 3 hours. So again, demonstrating just a remarkable near twofold greater increase in fat oxidation during submaximal exercise. This wasn't too surprising, because we had some inclination this would be the case from Steve Finney's work back in the early 80s, but that was only 4 weeks of keto adaptation. And in that work, they showed a marked attenuation of glycogen during exercise. And that's fully what we expected to see. So here's some circulating markers. The ketones were higher, as you would expect, and they increased during exercise. And you get this classic post-exercise ketosis as a response to endurance exercise, called the Cortis-Douglas effect. And so they're approximately twofold higher levels than the high carb athletes. We did a lot of circulating markers. I'm just going to show you a few here. This is serum glycerol. This is an indication of adipose tissue lipolysis, and you can see a marked increase in glycerol. So as you'd expect, these guys are breaking down more adipose tissue than their high carb counterparts. Now, this was what was really shocking to me, and I think for most people, that the glycogen levels in these guys were almost exactly the same as the high carb group at baseline, immediately post 3-hour run, and 2 hours post 3-hour run. And we know these guys are burning nearly all fat. So the question is, why on earth would they bother to break down glycogen when they have an abundant supply of fatty acids and acetyl-CoA for the Krebs cycle to make ATP? And if you do the math in terms of the molar or gram quantity of glycogen broken down in these low-carb athletes relative to the carbohydrate that was oxidized during the 3-hour run, there's over 100-gram difference. In other words, there's 100 grams of glucose that's not accounted for here from glycogen that was broken down to glucose. So it wasn't terminally oxidized. And the question is, why would these keto-adapted athletes bother to do that? And we of course don't know for sure. We have some speculation. We think that glucose may be an important source of oxaloacetate to keep the Krebs cycle running. So you can break down glycogen to provide glucose to pyruvate to oxaloacetate, and it wouldn't show up in CO2 in the breath because it's not terminally oxidized, but that keeps the Krebs cycle running for the fatty acids that are in supply. It also could be serving a source of glucose for the pentose phosphate pathway, which we tend to forget about, but it's an important pathway for glutathione synthesis, as well as NADH, NADPH, and also a source of ribose for nucleotide synthesis. And so those types of pathways may be important to ensure the keto-adapted athlete is providing those intermediates of metabolism for proper fueling.
Why don't they pump them?
And what?
It seems like they're depleting their glycogen stores at the same rate. Do you have usage of that glycogen? Why is it that they don't get to the end of their effort, at about the same time that the high carb guys would?
Well, these guys aren't fatiguing at 3 hours, so these glycogen levels aren't associated with fatigue in this experiment anyway.
The point that they got to the point that they deplete their glycogen store, do you think they both kind of fall apart at the same time?
That's a great question, and if we could have taken this out to 6 hours, I think that's where you would have seen a differential, where the high carb guys would be suffering because they're glycogen depleted and probably close to bonking. That's where the keto adaptation really starts to distinguish itself, because
suddenly it seems like those people don't need their glycogen stores anymore to do all those processes.
Well, that's right, because they're keto adapted.
What's going on after the orgasm?
Yeah.
We're going to have a panel discussion after the call, but
Sorry.
So, and then there's the resynthesis of glycogen. That, how do these guys resynthesize glycogen when we're not providing really any carbohydrates post-exercise? And again, we don't know for sure, but the glycerol can be a source of carbons for the lactate was actually slightly higher in these keto-adapted athletes. And so that you could actually have direct glycogen synthesis by lactate, or it could be indirectly serving as a gluconeogenic substrate for glycogen. But what's really amazing here is there are some profound long-term adaptations to a ketogenic diet that preserve glycogen levels and really alter glycogen metabolism that in a way that was completely unexpected. And this, again, is very different than Finney's work, so it suggests that 4 weeks is probably not, you don't see the full adaptations to a ketogenic diet. And that kind of fits with what a lot of athletes comment, that they get an additional benefit after 6 months or even years of being on this diet. So I thought I'd just quickly show you the cholesterol. I talked a lot about cholesterol yesterday and noted that these athletes had extremely high cholesterol. As you can see here, their LDL cholesterol is almost twofold higher. Their HDL is also remarkably higher, and some incredibly high levels here that are the highest levels I've ever seen. Such that when you look at the ratio of total cholesterol to HDL, they're actually similar. And then when you look further into the LDL particle heterogeneity here, looking at the different particle sizes, the low-carb guys, despite having those tremendously higher LDL cholesterol, actually have fewer small LDL particles. And so all that is in the larger LDL particles. And when you look at a score of insulin sensitivity based on the, I think it's 7 or 8 of these NMR parameters that you get from the lipo profile from LipoScience, you see these guys are markedly more insulin sensitive based on these lipoprotein particle distributions than the high carb guys. Now these guys aren't insulin resistant by any means. I put this scale up here, so they're within the 25th percentile, but these guys are probably down in the 1 or 2 percentile insulin sensitivity. And we've done a lot of other work with this FASTER study that we haven't published yet. My doctoral student Kathy Sines, who's really spearheaded this project, has done a lot of work with the gene expression data. So we have full muscle transcriptomic from RNA-seq on these guys from skeletal muscle, where we're still sifting through. We have over 25,000 data points of different genes here. These are some of the top genes, though, and most of these are pretty predictable. This is involved in histone deacetylase or histone modification, which is interesting given the role of beta-hydroxybutyrate on histones. But these are all enzymes in lipid metabolism. Or this one's actually glycogen metabolism. This is first enzyme in ketogenesis. This is an enzyme in beta oxidation. So there's clearly some upregulation at the gene level happening here, and there's a whole host of other genes that we're sifting through as well. And we've got metabolomic data as well from skeletal muscle that we're still mining. So I'm almost done here. I need to give Jake time because he's got the really exciting stuff. What's really interesting is the high-carb guys were really fascinated with what was going on with the low-carb guys, and we actually had 2 high-carb guys that we know of that shared with us that they had switched to a low-carb diet after the study and had remarkable outcomes, really transformative outcomes. And I think there's a tremendous application here for the not just athletes. It's great if we can help an athlete run a little faster, but what I'm really passionate about is how can we help our soldiers improve their health, improve their physical and cognitive performance, because most of these guys are, especially at the special ops level, I mean, they're elite athletes, and they're just not competing in sports. They're fighting for our freedoms and fighting our enemies. And there's many reasons why I think that's the case, and we're trying to pursue that. And as has been mentioned many times, keto adaptation and the effects of ketogenic diets are not simple. There's not a single target. They're highly pleiotropic. And so part of that's metabolic, enhancing fat oxidation, which we've shown occurs in a very profound way. But there's many other effects of keto adaptations probably occurring through different effects of beta-hydroxybutyrate, ultimately leading to a wide array of physiologic adaptations and phenotypes that are relevant to a lot of different outcomes for athletes and just general fitness enthusiasts.